Hello, everyone. Welcome to Thursday, April 2nd. This is a devotional time that I've been able to do Wednesdays and Thursdays for the last few weeks. Okay, I think it's only been a week. It just feels like a long time. So once you sign on, do send either a comment or a hello, especially if you're having trouble hearing me. Um, I change spaces, I change rooms for this recording between Wednesday and Thursday. So I always like to check that this room, the acoustics and light are still okay. I have a bit of a shadow on me today, so I may try and fix that before we begin. I might have fixed it too much. It's a bit better. Those of you who have not yet spent some devotional time with me, we are sharing both some teaching and some prayer time on Wednesdays and Thursdays. This is a chance to experience some of the programming at Robertson Wesley that we do. One of them this year has been called Marks for the Quest. It's been a monthly meeting of people, sometimes the same folks all the way through, but there are folks also dropping in. We meet once a month to check in on our spiritual journey through the marks of discipleship, which is a practice expanded from Michael Foss's book about leadership called Power Surge. He suggested some spiritual practices that become marks for our Christian lives, signs that we are working at our relationship with God, serving Jesus, and being in relationship with one another. And so we've expanded the marks to include a few things that we felt were essential. And then we placed one mark for each month this year. And while the whole world has changed since our planning, which was almost a year ago now, the marks are still signposts for us. They are signposts for us to remember to pray, to worship, to read scripture, to gather together and listen for the Spirit, to learn how to serve and be served, to give and to receive. And soon we'll be entering into the season of Easter, which will be a time for us to look at giving and balance. How do we find balance? And it was because of that theme, balance, that I began to turn back to Saint Benedict, a monk who lived in the 500s, who lived in a time when the Roman Empire was collapsing and there was utter chaos in everyone's world because of that. And I thought that sounded familiar. Chaos around the world. People split up who used to be together. And so I thought St. Benedict's pattern of life for his monks would be helpful for us to look at as we begin to find pattern in this current time, which will be a time we did not choose to set aside, but it is a time we've been set aside. And we now need to learn how to live in it intentionally. We have in this series so far looked at 3 of the triads that St. Benedict held to be true. St. Benedict's rule is available in a very good translation by Timothy Fry. And it has some long chapters and some very, very short chapters. I'm just going to check here. I always forget how many in all. I think it's 73. 73. And some of it is very specific to how to live in a monastic community. But many, many people through the centuries have discovered it can be used to live any Christian pattern. It's a pattern for Christian life. So the first thing we talked about was St. Benedict's hope that we would find a place, a community, a home to be stable in, to be faithful to. St. Benedict hoped that we would have in our life conversio, which is a word he used to encompass both convert every day, recommit your life to Christ, and also the zeal that Christ brings to our life, the inner energy to mature, to grow, to be. And then he spoke about obedience, about finding those elders and teachers and leaders who we trust and following their wisdom. Yesterday, we talked about the triad of the inner life of the monastery: work, including washing dishes when it's your turn, pray, and study. We spoke a lot yesterday about prayer as both something that happens in worship for the monks, using the Psalms as their guide, and also happens individually in solitude and silence. Not a lot of time was set aside by monks for communal prayer or for a lot of wordy prayer. It was a very silent space. And St. Benedict said this was for two reasons. One is, do not disturb your neighbor. And the other is that in silence we can remember that God is talking in prayer as well as us, that we may cry out. And in the crying out, God has already responded and invites us to be in communication with God. Today, we are going to look at the three relationships of a monk or of a Christian. And we will reflect on maybe how are those pieces reflected in our lives, even though, to my knowledge, no monk has watched one of these yet. The other question I received the other day from one of you was about the quilts. You will notice that in each of the places I do live videos so far, there are quilts. When I'm in this room, I have hung this quilt behind me. This is a quilt from the Duick family, a beautiful gift to remind us that we are home. In worship, I used a purple quilt with a very fancy, I believe it's called a pinwheel pattern. And it was made by Karen Munt and was gifted to me as part of my healing process after the Slave Lake fires. The quilters and the weavers of the world gifted us with prayer shawls and quilts. And that is the one that held me in that time. And lastly, if you were here yesterday, you saw behind me a quilt of pink and green and flowers. That quilt was created by Grace Small, and it was in thanks to some work I had done on a pastoral charge in Spiritwood, Saskatchewan. And so quilts, shawls, favorite tops, these are some of the things I'm surrounding myself with to give that extra sense of comfort and centeredness in this time of great change. Now, St. Benedict has, as I said, 73 rules. But in one of the chapters, chapter 4, he actually then sets aside time to write about 73 tools to live a good life, to do good work in the world. He begins where Jesus began. First of all, love the Lord your God. Love with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And like Jesus, he follows it up with the 10 Commandments, a reminder that we are to not kill, to not break our promises or lie in witness. We are to honor those who care for us. We are not to steal or be envious. And we are to keep the Sabbath, to avoid idols. And remember that God is one. St. Benedict then goes on to speak about the fact that while there are tons of good works to be done, one must begin with disciplining our body, mind, and heart. That our way of acting should be different than some of the patterns we see in the world. We are not to act in anger. We are not to inwardly nurse a grudge. We are not to give ourselves hollow greetings, ourselves as well as others. We are to keep true to our values and remind ourselves of the truths in our lives. This and those things we talked about yesterday, prayer, study, and work, are parts of the way St. Benedict wants us to be in good relationship with ourselves. There are times when we are so focused on another person or on other people, on an issue, that we can almost leave our body. We can forget that we have boundaries, that we have skin and muscle that contain us and hold us, and that within our bodies there are both great gifts of energy and limitations of what we can do. We are all diverse. So all of our bodies are, of course, very different in and of themselves physically, but also they're very different in the amounts of energy we can give and receive from the world. During this different, strange time, you may be finding yourself having much less energy, which is partly because you are learning your new normal. You may find yourself having a lot less energy because you are surrounded by people all day long, where in your life before you could go to work even for a couple of hours and take a breath. One of the folks watching us right now has two amazing, amazing children that I'm sure she would love to just pause. Just for a while, just pause. Now, some of us are also feeling like we've got lots of energy, like too much energy. And that's those of us who are used to being able to go to work, physically move to a new location for work, create, play, interact with people. Can you hear me, Reverend Karen? Like this is, and so for some of us, we'll have kind of an overabundance of energy because we are being asked to go less places, see less people. That too, in a sense, is a limitation because we need to find ways to use that energy in ways that use it in a healthy way. To instead of freaking out, having temper tantrum, learning new times to play, new ways to play, getting out to exercise or exercising at home, being in good relationship with our body. This also means being in good relationship with our heart and soul. If you are someone who's finding you have more time in your day, this may be a time to read one of those books that you've been wanting to read, to learn something more about yourself. A book I began, it's been about a year that I have lived with the book called The Happiness Trap. This book kind of blew my mind. It didn't teach me anything I hadn't known. It just put it in a frame that was my aha. And so all year, I had spent time with the learnings of that book. Things like, when the world says that you should be happy, you don't have to be. When the world says you should be feeling sad and anxious, you don't have to. You're going to feel what you feel. The other piece of the book is about how our brain criticizes our brain. This is called the inner critic, and lots of different teachers have taught about it. This is the part of us who always wonders if we did it right or is really sure we did not do it right. All of us have an inner critic. Some are loud, some are quiet. Some, like mine, change the volume every day. A lot of what your inner critic is telling you, it's not that it's lies. What I realized this year from many teachers is that your inner critic actually was really important. They were your inner adult when you were a child. They were the ones who told you as a child, oh, Dad's home early. That means he might be mad. So I will be really quiet for 30 minutes because I know then he'll have some more energy. This is how we learn as children. And we try and remember our lessons. Oh, when I ask with a please, I get things. So the difficulty is then we grow up and we learn what our values are. We learn who we want to be. It takes a lifetime. But the inner critic still thinks you are a 3-year-old in dire need of instruction. And so you will walk into a new job at 25 or 35 or 55 years of age and say, hello, I'm an adult, I know what I'm doing. And your inner critic will say, be careful, watch out, be very, very worried. Or perhaps your inner critic is much clearer. You walk into the new job and you're ready and you're ready and your inner critic says, why did you put that on this morning? That shirt always makes you look very pale. Our inner critic really is trying to help. So we don't need to feel angry at that voice. We rather just need to remind that voice that we're adults now and we know some things. I know that when I wear a blouse that makes me look pale, the world will not end. That the people who truly know me will know that pale or bright red, I'm still Lee. We also can make decisions about our own values. So my inner critic might say it's very important to obey all the rules. By the way, that is what my inner critic says. And yet, there have been times when the rules were unjust. Now, I still try really hard to follow other rules, meaning I would follow the rules on how to change the rules. But sometimes it means protesting. Sometimes it means doing something really against the grain, like advising your board at church to not have worship together. When the staff brought that recommendation to the board at Robertson Wesley, as much as we were absolutely sure it was the correct decision, it was against so much tradition. Robertson Wesley hadn't canceled Sunday worship since the Spanish flu. That going against the grain had my inner critic chatting. And I just had to say to her, thanks. Every other day you're right on this matter. Today, though, we are the adults making these decisions. There are some great exercises of what to do with your inner critic. Some people say you should draw them. Others say learn their voices. There's a meditation you can do where you imagine that they are on a tape recorder, if you're old enough to have tape recorders, and you turn down the volume. Again, we're not throwing the tape out. We're not disrespecting this important part of ourselves. And we need to put that recording down. This is one of the ways we maintain a good relationship with self, is to treat ourselves with compassion and love and make decisions that are good and right for us from the wisdom around us and within us, rather than listening to outside voices. Now, most of the 73 tools for a good life that St. Benedict talks about is actually about being in good relationship with God and with others. In the United Church of Canada, we have quite a tradition of how we want to be in relationship with others. We work very hard to make sure processes are just, not just the decisions that come out of our meetings, but the meetings themselves need to be held in ways that hold everyone to be equal, included, and accountable. The difficulty is we sometimes forget that as important as our relationship with others is, we also have a relationship with God. And in that relationship comes something called grace. It's amazing. Grace it is offered, given freely. It is forgiveness, encouragement, affirmation that you are exactly who the Holy One wants you to be, and that you know you best, and what you need to do to express yourself is good. Grace. Sometimes we can get so wrapped up in making sure we treat others well or that we protect others' rights. We can begin to think that that work is why God loves us. Because I work hard, because I forgive easy, because I feed the poor, because I volunteer for my church. That is why God is in relationship with me. So St. Benedict would remind you of the first step again. Love your God, for God loves you. Begin there and end there, and always come back to that center when you need it. Now, this means that there are times when we will not be enough for our family, for our community, for ourselves. We will disappoint ourselves or our neighbors, and we may feel guilty about that. Guilt is important sometimes to help us go over what happened and realize how we want to do it again next time. Guilt is helpful because sometimes it helps us ask for help. How could I have done that better? But at no time does guilt, making messes, not being enough, separate us from God and our relationship with God. I was on a Zoom call today. It was actually a prayer meeting. It had ministers from across Canada, not very many. Most of us don't have time to go to all the Zoom meetings there are. And one of the ministers offered a beautiful prayer of confession. Again, in the United Church, we wonder about prayers of confession. We don't want people to think that they are innately sinful, because you are innately amazing and wonderful and blessed. And yet sometimes our behavior is not amazing. This minister asked God's forgiveness for a thought. Not because he thought the prayer would help the thought go away or the feeling that led to it, but he wanted God to know, when this thought comes, I will be aware of it. I will put it down. Receive grace, forgiveness, love, and try and enact love rather than that thought. The thought was, what on earth are these people who are still getting together, like physically? What are they thinking? Oh, I hope maybe they'll get sick and that'll teach. Uh, I don't know about you, but I have been feeling some anger. As some of the folk on social media have been saying, it's like we're in a school project to stay home. And some people aren't doing the project. And the longer they don't do the project, the longer we're going to have to stay inside. It's very difficult. It's also difficult to stay at home. I got a note from a neighbor. They thought we were being too loud. Luckily, I did not respond right away. Instead, my partner and I pondered, wow, they've never worked from home before. Both he and I had. We know what it's like to work from home and have odd noises going on and on. We thought about the fact that they probably don't have kids. Some people are working from home and being interrupted by actual loud children, not just footsteps on the ceiling. We tried to assume best intentions. And it helped. It helped me apologize for the thoughts that were hurtful. My neighbors weren't hurt by my thoughts, but I was. And I don't ever want my thoughts to turn into judgments, resentments, grudges. And so I have been trying to assume best intentions. When I see a group of people together, I try and remember that they could be a household. They could have mental illness that is leading them to create a new household. They've picked perhaps 5 friends that they are going to meet together in the park and hug because that will save them, will treat their depression enough that they can see themselves through this time. When I'm at the store and someone comes within my bubble, I remember how many things I forgot yesterday because of my fuzzy brain, my pandemic fuzz of a brain that forgets what day it is. And I try and think they aren't aware of my bubble or theirs. They're just trying to find enough supplies to not go over budget and to feed their family and to stay healthy. I want everyone to follow all the orders and all the rules because that's what my inner critic and I would really like. But instead, I can do what I can do. I can keep to my bubble, stay home, try and walk quieter so I don't bother my neighbors as much, though I'm definitely not going to do that perfectly. I can call a friend when I need a laugh. And I can continue to pray. Prayer is the central way that Christians have been in communication with God forever. But a lot of people think prayer is one thing or another. They think perhaps prayer is like a meditation of mindfulness, where one sits in stillness and is aware of one's breath. That is prayer. But prayer also is chatting to yourself, over talking to yourself a little bit. Dear God, I don't know what to do about this situation or that. Laying out options in front of us. And then listening. Seeing where our core values and God come together. Sometimes, and something I'm finding very helpful in this time, and what St. Benedict really loved, was the repetition of prayers you have prayed forever. One thing we talked about yesterday is that every week, every 7 days in the monastery, the monks would go through all 150 Psalms. and repeat some within that same week. Can you imagine? Every year, 52 times, you would do 150 of the same prayers. Part of me wants to reject this because I love new and surprising ways to pray, to go for a walking prayer with your whole body, a dancing prayer without being too loud, a dancing prayer. But repetition allows for two things. It allows for the words to become new each time. In repetition of a prayer or scripture, the new thing might pop out. I'd never read the Psalms so aware that my enemy is sometimes a virus. The Psalms talk a lot about enemies, and most of the writers, their enemies were actual armies at the gate. But for me, my enemies have always been within or between peoples, meaning addiction, mental health, this illness, things that I wrestle with, that I want to fight against, and that God asks me to trust God to take care of. So to read through the Psalms, and every time you see enemy, replace it with chaos during pandemic, anxiety during pandemic, viruses during pandemic, social injustices and systemic poverty in a pandemic. Old repetitive Psalms become new again. The other thing about repetition is that it comes sometimes with a bit of openness. When I'm not seeking to find the words to express to God my feelings, if they're gifted to me, I can say more in my prayer and be more aware of listening. I'm not shocked at the surprise of a new liturgy, but rather comforted and centered. We started today talking about the limitations that our body gives us. God gave us limitations 24 hours a day on this earth of ours, and only so many days per week. Only 4 seasons, even though in Edmonton it always seems like 2 or 16 seasons. The scriptures, and in particular the Psalms for St. Benedict, was another example of a limitation, something we would put on to allow us to not get distracted, divided, to allow us to stick to this narrow, loving way of Christ. One where the 10 Commandments hold us on one side, Scripture's stories hold us on the other, where under our feet is God, earth. Above our head is that Spirit blowing, and before, behind, and within us is Christ. Indwelling, incarnate, understanding and forgiving, hoping that you find a way in this time to be free as much as possible, free of anxiety and guilt, and as much as possible, abundant in hope. Thought it would be good to close our reflections on St. Benedict with his words. And next week, if you are still able to join us on Wednesday and Thursday, we will be in the midst of Holy Week. And so I will be doing some teaching about what is Holy Week and what are all the steps, and why are Karen and Lee on Facebook doing worship services Thursday through Sunday next week. St. Benedict from chapter 4. Now, don't inspire to be called holy before you really are. First, be holy that you may more truly be called so. Live by God's commandments every day. Treasure faithfulness. Harbor neither hatred nor jealousy for anyone. Do nothing out of envy. Don't love quarreling and shun arrogance. Respect the elders. Love the young. Pray for your enemies out of your love for Christ. And if you have a dispute with someone, make peace with them before the sun goes down. And finally, never lose hope in God's mercy. These then are the tools of the spiritual craft. When we have used them without ceasing day and night and have returned them on Judgment Day, on God's great day of hope and love, we will be rewarded. With what? Well, the eye has not seen nor the ear heard what God has prepared for us. But we get to we get to toil in this workshop, in this community, faithfully. All these tasks are done in the enclosure of our faith and in the stability of our community. I pray that your community cares for you and that you care for your community. I pray that God's grace is tangible to you, the freely unearned forgiveness and adoration and affirmation that God has for you. Peace be with you, and I'll talk to you soon.